This time on Poll Hub, you've heard of the Great Resignation, but what about the Great Creation? No, it's not biblical, but it is real, and we're talking to an expert on workplace trends from the Gallup poll to explain. Then has no nukes, I'm dating myself here, from the 1970s become mo nukes today? Nuclear power has been out of favor for so long, you may be surprised to hear it's making a tentative comeback in the US. And the reason? Because it may be a net positive for the environment. And we finish with a very different version of classic Americana from our friends at the CBS News 60 Minutes Vanity Fair poll, of course. Let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Mary Griffith.
I'm Hunter Petro.
And I am Lee Marengoff.
Well, Hunter, in the wake of the COVID pandemic, lots of attention was paid to the so-called Great Resignation. But are we actually moving toward the Great Creation? Let's start with a few statistics here. So more than 44 million Americans quit their jobs in 2023. And in January of 2024 alone, 3.4 million workers quit their jobs. But the hiring rate has actually outpaced the quit rate since November of 2020. And Americans are now telling us that they are extremely satisfied or very satisfied with the relationship with their coworkers. According to data from Pew, 67% of workers had that impression. More than 6 in 10 said that they had a good relationship with their manager or supervisor. And nearly 8 in 10 reported that they felt that they were treated with respect.
Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows the number of people quitting their jobs has hit a 3-year low. JOLTS, which is the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, reported that employers posted around 8.2 million jobs in June, which was a downshift from the 8.24 that they reported in May. The rate of quits was 2.1% in June. This was the lowest we've seen it since June of 2020. The number of estimated quits dropped to 3.282 million from 3.4 million and landed at the lowest monthly total since November of 2020. However, despite half of Americans being satisfied and available jobs shrinking, there's still a large group who don't want to work for anyone. The Shopify/Gallup entrepreneurship study found that 62% of Americans want to be their own boss. Only 35% would prefer to work for someone else. And of those who said they wanted to be their own boss, 52% said they were willing to take on a fair amount of financial risk just to do so. And we can see Americans putting their money where their mouth is, because in 2023, we saw 5.5 million new businesses being started, continuing a trend of record high numbers of new business applications being filed over the last several years. There have already been about 885,000 new business applications filed in 2024. And now we're going to bring in Jim Garter, who is the Chief Scientist of Workplace Management and Wellbeing over at Gallup, to answer some questions and give us a little more context here on this kind of issue. So thank you so much for coming back onto the show, Jim.
Thanks for having me again, Hunter. And Mary, great to be with you.
Thank you so much. So Jim, let's just start off with the very basic question. What's going on? What accounts for the shift in the workforce today?
Well, what I tend to spend a lot of time studying, I'm not an economist, I'm a workplace psychologist, and so I tend to study how people are perceiving their jobs. And we've been tracking in the U.S. here, we've been tracking that quarterly. Globally, we have an annual report on how people feel about their work. We tend to use a little bit different bar than satisfaction or what I'd call contentment with work. And we really look at what leads to high performance in organizations, and we call that engagement, but it's really how involved and enthusiastic people feel about their work and workplace. And to just paint a picture of what's been happening over the last several years, engagement hit a peak right before the pandemic at about 36%. And that was a 10-year-long increase in engagement, representing millions of workers who are more engaged than they'd been in the past. And then all the disruption with the pandemic and the Great Resignation coincided with a drop in employee engagement and how people feel about their work. That drop has continued, was at about 33% engaged employees back toward the end of last year. And then what we saw in the first quarter was a significant drop of about 30% engaged employees. Now we're seeing a little bit more of a tick back up. So I think what you're referring to, and I think one of the hidden findings inside of all this is that people have gradually, as engagement has dropped, they've felt more disconnected from their employer. If you look at elements like how they feel, whether they're extremely satisfied, I'm not talking about just barely, a little satisfied, but extremely satisfied with their company, which we know is a really important metric, that's dropped significantly. They also feel less connected to the mission or purpose of their organization than they have in the past. So there's a bit of a disconnect. You can call some of this transition a great disconnect between employee employer. And so psychologically, people feel less connected. There's been a little bit of a rebound second quarter. We're getting ready to update the third quarter statistics. And one of the reasons for the disconnect is that we're working in different ways than we ever have before. And people are less clear on what's expected of them. They've been in their jobs not long enough to really know, to have a chance to do what they do best at work. And you have to be in a job a significant amount of time to be able to do what you do best on a regular basis. We're starting to see a little bit more of an uptick now in that, because I think what you're talking about with the labor market now is people are in their jobs a little bit more than they had before. They're less likely to shift, even though I would caution people are still looking. Over half of people are still looking for new work, but they've been in their jobs long enough now that we've seen a little bit of an uptick in terms of both engagement and in terms of them feeling like they have a chance to do what they do best and have more role clarity in terms of what they're doing every day.
Yeah, Jim, it's fascinating. Is there a demographic or certain demographics that this is more prevalent with?
We saw significant changes, particularly among young people. And when you look at remote workers, a lot of the disconnect was, so you think about physical distance starts to become mental distance if it's not managed in the right way. Now, there's some organizations that are doing exceptional work because they've got great managers who are in touch with people on a regular basis, kind of pulling them in psychologically and meeting with them at least once a week so that they're connected. But on average, we've seen younger workers, I'm talking about young millennials and Gen Z workers, where we saw the biggest drop in engagement and, again, remote. But we're starting to see, again, second quarter, we started to see a bit of a rebound, and it was that particular group where we saw the rebound. Particularly Gen Z employees were significantly more likely to say they have an opportunity to do what they do best. So maybe the labor market's affected that somewhat, where they now feel like they need to stay with the same employer for at least long enough to be able to get to know their work. And that's a big factor. Length of service is a big factor. People keep switching. But I think what you referred to earlier in terms of people wanting to be their own boss, that makes a lot of sense, because through the pandemic, we learned a lot about autonomy. That was a strength from the pandemic, was people learned that they can do some work independently. And the downside, though, was that the management became a bit more disconnected from people. And less in-person time had some ramifications as well. So that was a factor. But the demographic where we saw the biggest shift was clearly among younger workers and more remote employees. But again, we've seen some companies really master that well with those groups. So it really comes down to how well they're managed.
Our viewers would know a few weeks ago, we actually did a whole show on TikTok and how people in Gen Z are making an entire future off running their own company, but it's just a social media account that they're getting paid to do. So thinking about these things, the shift away from a traditional employment model and more towards sole entrepreneurship, what type of long-term effects do you see this kind of shift taking? How do you think this could reshape the future of work in America, if at all? Or, do you think it's a temporary, we're still a little rebounding from COVID, people are still trying to get comfortable with what they're doing?
Well, I think entrepreneurship is a great thing. And I think that for the ones that are successful, it's awesome that they can build their own business. And I think that's fantastic that they've learned that they can do some things and have that level of autonomy. There's going to be some risk that comes with that, of course. But many employees, especially young employees, want opportunities to develop. And being in a workplace where they have mentorship and where they can learn from other people's experiences and have interactions with coworkers is also a factor that's important to a lot of employees. And, when we were tracking even before the pandemic what the younger generation was looking for, they wanted work that connected to a mission or purpose, that was connected to something bigger. And the best way to get that done, you can get that done through your own entrepreneurship, of course, but you can also get it done by connecting with an organization that has a mission that you really believe in. But that means you've got to have great managers that help you see how your work connects to that mission. So I think there's two sides to it. One is the entrepreneurship is great if it's successful and people are willing to take on that risk that comes with it, with that level of autonomy and independence. I think that's great if it works, but I think there's still a lot of employers and employees who need, I'm not going to say it's a traditional model because I don't think anything's traditional anymore. We've completely changed what's normal in terms of work. Hybrid is the most desired for people who can work remote jobs. Hybrid is the most popular form, and it's not changing that much right now. But with hybrid comes complexity and challenges both for leadership and management to make sure that they're in touch with people and that they manage performance in the right kind of way.
Yeah, Jim, that's a question that came to my mind as we're focusing a lot on what employees are looking for and their engagement and their satisfaction. What are managers telling you in your research about their experiences and perhaps the challenges that they're facing within this new workplace environment?
Well, they're reporting higher levels of burnout That's been increasing. They're actually, managers themselves have been looking for other work. That might settle down. It settled down a little bit with the second quarter, and the changes in the economy probably affected that somewhat. But in terms of looking, but still, if you have half of people looking for other work, that's not a good thing. And their engagement is not much higher than the people they manage. So what managers are telling us is that their jobs are more complex than ever, and they need their role simplified into more people management. Let's get rid of as much of the administrative stuff as possible and make sure that they can spend their time being in touch with people, particularly this increase in remote work. Some managers are squeezed between what leadership says they want. They might want more people in the office, but the manager has to manage that in a way that still honors the autonomy that attracts employees, but at the same time get them in person enough so that they can have the kinds of interactions that our human nature really needs to build and thrive and have those social connections. So the complexity's up, but I think there's solutions for it. We've got to simplify the role of manager into more like a coach, where they're mainly responsible for setting expectations, ongoing conversations, and having high levels of accountability so that people can see how well they're doing.
On that note, I want to thank Dr. Jim Garter for joining us today, Chief Scientist of Workplace Management and Wellbeing over at Gallup. Thank you so much for the perspective and answering some questions today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So over the years, events like Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and Fukushima have changed how people think of nuclear power. When I was a kid, nuclear power was the future of energy. I grew up in Southern California. There was a nuclear plant just down the coast from us. Obviously, there's a plant just south of Marist College that was online for a real long time. But those events changed the perception, not only here, but in the rest of the world, of nuclear power. What's interesting, though, is that things have changed again, and at least part of that is because of climate change and the potential that nuclear power has to help us not destroy the planet on a faster rate than we're already doing. So what's been going on in the news when it comes to nuclear power? In early July, Biden signed a bipartisan bill to boost nuclear energy in the U.S. It's speeding up the licensing processes. It's reducing fees. A new plant, one of the first new plants in decades, just opened in Georgia in the last year and is providing lots of power to that state. And overall, nuclear power accounts for about 18.5% of all the electricity generated in the U.S. This was last year in 2023, according to the U.S. Energy Department's Information Administration.
But is it safe? Because memories of disasters definitely linger. According to research from the Office of Nuclear Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy, nuclear is one of the cleanest forms of energy. It's zero emissions, minimal land footprint, and it produces minimal waste by volume. Still, accidents do happen, and when they do, they are considerably more catastrophic than an oil or a coal power plant failing. And disposal of radioactive waste has never been totally resolved in the US. So how do Americans feel about nuclear energy now? Public attitudes toward clean energy did a global survey in 2023 and found that 20,000 respondents from over 20 countries, of those, only 28% opposed nuclear energy usage. Support was found to be highest in countries like China. And in May of 2024, Visconti Research conducted a survey that found favorability for nuclear power usage as a means to supply energy at 77% among US adults. This is the highest number ever in their polling. In June 2024, Pew found 56% of US adults favor more nuclear power plants to generate electricity.
So things have changed, but real quick, before we get to our guest, let's go back to July of 1977. A CBS News New York Times poll asked, do you approve of building more nuclear plants? In that time, 69% said yes. So it was higher than it is now, but not a huge amount higher. But then Gallup had asked a similar question the year before, but they asked it slightly different. They said, so would you like to add nuclear power plants within 5 miles of your home? And only 42% said yes to that. So NIMBY was in full swing with nuclear power back in 1977 and probably still is today. So a majority favor more, but they don't want it in their backyards. And as we mentioned, climate change is at least driving part of this. Dr. Jessica Boscarino is an associate professor of political science here at Marist. One of her areas of focus is on the intersection of environmental science and politics. Dr. Boscarino, Jessica, if I can call you that, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So what do you make of all of this? Is there really a resurgence in public opinion? I mean, public opinion seems to suggest that there's more acceptance than there was. Do you think that's real? And where does nuclear power lie in our solutions to global warming from a political standpoint?
Well, I think it's real. And I think, Jay, you mentioned climate change. I don't think we can underestimate the impact of that as being a real explanation behind these numbers. I think that we're at a point now where there is large acceptance of the reality and dangers of climate change. And this is, once it's constructed, a zero emission source. So it's really attractive from many standpoints as a part of our energy mix. That being said, there are a lot of challenges when it comes to nuclear energy that we can talk about, including safety and all of these concerns.
And piggybacking off the safety aspect there, do you think the current rules, restrictions, limits are detailed enough to prevent another nuclear incident?
I mean, I think this is the most highly regulated industry in the country and probably worldwide. So, absolutely. And one of the challenges that I alluded to is just how long it takes to build new nuclear capacity, in large part because of the regulations behind it and the really lengthy licensing process. So, I think we have these regulatory agencies in the US that are more than sufficient, right? And in fact, really responded to the latest nuclear disaster in Fukushima and said, we need to go back and look at all of our systems, and implemented new regulations as a result of that. So my personal concerns don't lie anywhere surrounding safety, because even if you look at those historic disasters, as catastrophic as they were, even Fukushima, I mean, if you look at the official death tolls, which were sizable, the vast majority of those deaths were attributed to non-nuclear related causes. So I believe, in fact, that the official death toll as a result of direct radiation exposure is only one person. That's not to minimize the effects of displacing an entire community of people, but just to say Chernobyl, I think, is actually not a fair comparison, because we know now that the safety mechanisms in place there were, even for the time, completely insufficient, and no plants would have ever been built that way in the US. So the short answer to your question is yes, I think that we can do this very safely.
So we're not alone in this. France gets most of its power from nuclear. Germany has now finally decommissioned all of their plants. These are neighboring countries with similar kind of populations in the European Union. They've gone entirely different directions. Where does the U.S. fit into the spectrum of having nuclear power as a source to eliminate carbon, and the other end of it being nuclear power is just too dangerous and that's not going to be a solution? We're going to do solar, we're going to do wind, we're going to do hydro, we're going to do whatever we can, but it's not going to be nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, in the US, I think the word I would use to describe it is inertia. We have not mentioned the new plant in Georgia, but that is really the first new reactors to come online in decades, essentially. But we did not shut down plants immediately as a response to Fukushima like Germany did. So we've just kept in a steady state of running a lot of plants that were already online. Now, some of them were already scheduled for decommission and have come offline for other reasons, just because their life cycle was up. But we've not really invested in new growth, and that's a big challenge because of that lengthy time process. If we were to decide tomorrow that this is what we wanted to do, we wanted to go wholesale nuclear, you're still talking decades before you really see that taking effect. So ramping up quickly is not something that's really possible with this industry.
And how do you think nuclear power compares to those more renewable sources like wind and solar in terms of cost, efficiency, reliability, et cetera?
I mean, in terms of cost, I believe that nuclear is still the most expensive option out there because it costs billions of dollars to build a reactor. There's huge construction costs, but there's also just costs associated with that permitting process and all of the legal aspects of that, the incredible insurance that's required because of the dangers behind it. So it's very expensive to get online. A plant can run for 80 years, right? So that's one way to get down those costs, but it's more expensive than the renewables for sure. Now, that is not accounting for if we had a carbon tax or something, which would bring down the cost of nuclear in relationship to other fossil fuels. But really, if you're comparing one-to-one nuclear and renewables, the renewables are definitely more affordable. However, there you have issues of scale and reliability, right? And that's where nuclear has the advantages, because it can run 24/7, very reliably, very predictably, and provide a lot of what they call baseload power. So you don't have the intermittency of when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing. You also don't have as many issues of locating those facilities in places that have the natural characteristics that would work, right? So sunnier parts of the country, solar is much more feasible. Same thing with wind. So if you have a water source, you can put a nuclear power plant there, right? So I think that really what we should be looking at is a mix because they have different strengths and weaknesses. And no one, I don't think, can really do it all for our current energy requirements.
You're a political scientist, and the politics of this is really interesting because for a while, nuclear was something that Republicans supported a little bit more than Democrats. Democrats in a certain era, no, it's bad. Then climate change slowly has increased the number of Democrats who support it. And so there's less partisan divide on this than there are on a lot of other issues. Is that something that would cause you to think that politically anyway, Joe Biden, after all, just signed bipartisan legislation to ease some of these rules and restrictions. Is this something that we're actually, as a country, politically kind of on the same page on?
Yes, I think that's right, actually. And I think as well, younger generations of Democrats might have a little less resistance simply because they lived through Fukushima, but we talk about 3 Mile Island was on U.S. soil. So I think that had a bigger impact on people that lived through that. The interesting thing politically, what I keep coming back to is when we came so close to solving the issue of long-term waste disposal, and we had a location and construction had started on this site in Nevada, and it was politics that killed it. And you mentioned NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Understandably, nobody is probably thrilled about the idea of having a nuclear waste disposal facility in their state, but Democratic leaders that happen to be from Nevada were able to kill that deal. And to me, that was a real moment of when we turned away from reconsidering nuclear, because that's one of those sticking points. We have to have a plan for what to do with this stuff.
Yeah, that is certainly one thing that has always been the sticking point. So that would have to be solved, I guess, before this moves into high gear. But anyway, Dr. Jessica Boscarino, thanks again so much for joining us. It's been really interesting to get a take on this as the public opinion begins to shift in another direction on nuclear energy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, and now we turn the page to fun fact time. This, I think, is going to get a little discussion going. It's from our pals at Vanity Fair, 60 Minutes, from June of 2010. The question being, if we wanted to update the expression as American as, and we wanted to not say as American as apple pie, well, what would be a good replacement? 23% said as American as an Apple iPod, which is like almost sounds the same. NASCAR, 23% also. Triple bacon cheeseburger, 21%. SUVs, 10%. And going to rehab, 8%. And don't know, don't answer, 15%. I would not relate to any of these. I would say like as American as a barbecue on July 4th or something like that. That might be what I would do. But someone else, tell me, what is about this?
Barb, jump in.
Oh, no way. I'm not taking a first shot at this. I have no idea. Although I do think it's cute that in 2010 it was an Apple iPod.
Yeah.
I don't remember when that was retired, but it was funny. I was cleaning out a closet a couple of weeks ago and I found an Apple iPod.
So did I, Barb. And my boys were like, does this work? What is this?
What is it? Right? Yeah.
No longer
And
as American as.
I was afraid to even see if A, if it worked, and B, what the playlists would be on it.
You couldn't, there's probably no adapter to plug it in, right?
That's true.
They use
That's
some, yeah.
true.
Anyway.
Although
So-
I say those too.
Oh, so you should do that. Bring it in, and you could do it as a history lesson for our students who don't know what it is that you'd be showing them, even though it's only from 2010. Anyway, the thing about, so I love these polls because we get crazy stuff out of them, but here's the thing I love, and I want to get Barb's take on this, about this one. So this is a 60 Minutes Vanity Fair poll, and they asked this question, but the name of the poll is Gulf Oil Spill from June of 2010. So they ask a series of questions about this devastating environmental disaster. How do you turn the corner, Barb, to go, oh, I ask you something else about iPods and going into rehab?
Hopefully gradually. And there is no really easy way to do that.
How about
Unless the
switching
survey-
topics?
Yes, switching
Switching topics.
topics. And on another topic, or on a lighter topic, we often say. But hopefully they did not go from the Gulf oil spill to this question. Hopefully there were a few in between. Even I think politics in 2010 would have been a little bit more amusing than the Gulf oil spill. But yeah, that is tricky. And so one should keep in mind that when we do see these questions, often they're part of larger polls that are on much more serious topics. And then these fun topics recall how we think about these are questions and choices when pollsters are up late at night. And this is what they dream up. They are generally at the end of the survey, far, far, far at the end of the survey before they hightail it out of town.
Can anybody help me on going to rehab? 8%?
So I saw this, and at first I was like, oh, God, what is it? What were they crazy? Or as Jay would say, what are they up too late, as Barb pointed out? But no, I looked at the year, and the surveys from 2010, what was going on around that time. And immediately my brain went to Amy Winehouse and the song Rehab, which was in the early 2000s. But then I looked to see what year she died, which was 2011. So I thought, okay, but that seemed too isolated. But in the early 2000s, Celebrity Rehab, the show with Dr. Drew Pinsky, began. And so I wondered perhaps if, because that took off and became something in culture, in pop culture, that perhaps that was a reason as American as going to rehab. I don't know, just a thought. I have no clue.
Thank you, Mary.
Good hunch, and probably as good as any of us have. Unless someone has anything better to offer, we're going to leave it right there.
Wait a second.
What about Hunter?
We have somebody who wasn't even born when the iPod was out. No, well, you were. But
Well,
what do you
I
think?
gotta
Americana, as American as apple pie, what would you pick?
I'm gonna say Apple iPod, which is crazy. And I was born when the Apple iPod was out. Okay, I'm not. Yeah, there was nothing reminds me more of my childhood, which felt so stereotypical American childhood than like putting my music on in my iPod with the wired earbuds and listening to my friends, and it was just a different time. And that is what makes me feel American. Honestly,
You and Barb should compare playlists. Maybe that'll be our
We
own
should.
fun fact.
We
We'll
should
generate
compare
our own
playlists.
fun
Bring
fact.
the iPod in. Yeah,
Yeah, mine was a 2008 iPod.
I was still alive.
I mean, we're alive. Not that you were still alive. Something's
I
wrong.
was alive by then.
All right. And now we have the rest of the story all done there. Okay. Until next week, folks.
That'll do it for Poll Hut this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Athen Hollis, Delaney Hayes, and Hunter Petro.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, consider telling a friend about us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
And finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you
In your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.